Fighting Through Podcast, Episode 86. German Boy Soldier, Part 2. Save the Last Bullet. More great unpublished history. At Kokoda, the latrines were all busy as many of the soldiers had dysentery, and Uncle Harry decided he had to go really bad, so walked into the jungle to have a dump. As he was doing so, he looked up and saw a Japanese soldier in a tree, with his gun pointed at him. The Führer had issued the Volkssturm, Home Guard decree, drafting all men between the ages of 16 and 60 because he was running out of soldiers. Anybody who could hold a gun was sent off to the front. Hello again, and another exciting World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Paul Cheel, son of Bill Cheel, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to read family stories, memoirs and interviews with veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. I'm so sorry I've been out of circulation during the summer, but holidays, COVID and recording the audiobook of Save the Last Bullet have just got in the way. Even my football team, Norwich City, have been underperforming. I was so disgusted the other week when they lost, I decided to stop supporting them, and in a fit of anger, I nailed my season ticket to a lamppost. And a few hours later, I decided it hadn't been a good idea, as I'd miss seeing my mates. So I went out to get it back, to find that someone had stolen the damn nail. Old uns but good uns. Thank you to my pal Wayne for that one. Oh dear. Another thing I've done while I've been away was to enter a photograph competition run by the British Normandy Memorial Trust, based at Vers-sur-Mer, just up from Gold Beach in France, in Normandy. My pick was a field full of bright red poppies, and in the distance was the memorial. You can see the photo in the show notes, and my prize is to feature on the November page of the calendar. The whole memorial complex has only recently been completed, and it's a dedication to the 22,000 British, French and other foreigners, both soldiers and citizens, killed during the World War II Normandy campaign under British command. I visited France in 2019 and saw the memorial before all the surrounding plaques and supporting structures were erected, so I was really lucky to get the shot that I did. My full visit to Normandy is covered in episode 45, and you can see a video I took of that poppy scene in the show notes to this current episode at fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk. The great thing about this memorial is that it's near Vers-sur-Mer, where an excellent Gold Beach museum is, and Gold Beach proper is just down the road, where the Green Howards, East Yorks and Sherwood Rangers Tank Regiment landed on 6th of June. It's only a short distance from Crepon, where the Green Howards Memorial is, and just 10 minutes drive from the busy town of Arromanches, and that's where you'll find that incredible artificial port, the Mulberry Harbour. If you'd like to support the British Normandy Memorial Trust and would like one of these super calendars, there's a link in the show notes. Lined up for you in this episode is a chapter from Heidi Langbein's newly published book about her German father as a 14-year-old boy soldier. I've got a family story sent in by Bernie Walker, and I've also heard from the family of one of my dad's comrades, Bill Vickers. And on that latter note, Ed Savage wrote in recently. Hi Paul, thanks for all the information on your website. Truly amazing. That's fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk. What an incredible man your father must have been. A friend of mine has just asked me if I will look into any information I can find on his wife Sharon's dad, Francis William Vickers. Francis was with the Greenhowards and won the military medal at Mareth in 1943. Any hints on where to start would be greatly appreciated. Well, after I'd peeled my eyebrows off the ceiling and my chin off the floor, I replied to Ed with some delight. William, better known as Bill Vickers, is a bit of a legend in my humble opinion. He was a pal of hero Rufty Hill, who was killed on Gold Beach, and Stan Hollis, VC. And the stories I've got about him are legend. I'm not going to repeat the stories in this episode because they're easy to find in a couple of episodes where I talk about him. He's interviewed in a book, Operation Scipio, written by Barry Barnes, and that's about the North African Battle of Wadi Akarit, when he gets into a right old scrap with the enemy. You'll need to check out the episodes themselves for his full story, but he was, of course, in the regimental band with Rufty and a few others. I do, however, want to share this tale from Barry's book, where at the end of the interview with Barry, Bill says, "Before the Battle of Wadi Akarit, 5 of my mates and me were sat talking, and the topic came up what we would do when the war was over and we got back home. One said he would open a newsagents and general store. Another said he hoped to get a lorry and go into the haulage business. The next one said he hoped to buy a minibus and run bus trips. The next one said he hoped to get his job back at the steelworks. The last one said he hoped to get a job in the building trade, because with all the houses destroyed and damaged in the air raids, there would be work for years. Then I was asked, what are you going to do when you get home, Bill? My answer was, I'm going to wait until I get home. I knew we had a lot more battles to fight, and I was right. Fate decreed that of the 6 of us, I was the only one to get home. 2 were killed at Mareth, 2 killed in Sicily, and lastly, my best mate Rufty Hill was one of the first killed on the beach on D-Day. None of them were married or had children. Fate decreed my wife Gladys and I should have 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, 1 for each of my mates and 1 for me. So these kids must include Sharon, the lady who's currently digging for information on her dad. So Sharon, if you're listening, now you know about your dad. So you must have a couple of sisters and 3 brothers, the ones Bill referred to above. Ed, thank you so much for getting in touch. I've given you copies of everything I've got for the family on Bill, including a load of photographs. You can hear all about Bill Vickers in episodes 25 and 78, and there are links in the show notes. Ed went on to explain a little bit more. He said, I met Sharon's husband, i.e. Bill's son-in-law, Keith, on a charity convoy to Ukraine about a month ago, and we got talking about the research I'd done into my grandfather's war, so he asked if I'd have a look into his wife's dad. Can't thank you enough. Looks like I'd better buy the book now. Keith has just given me some information on his own efforts to raise money to help Ukraine. And he says, my own Just Giving page is Ed Savage is fundraising for Yorkshire Aid Convoy. And I raised over 2,500 for the first convoy, which was then matched by my employer, BP. Alternatively, you can put people in contact with the Yorkshire Aid Convoy website, and I'm putting a link in the show notes to that. There's a pic of a smiling King Charles on their website too. Our second convoy truck, nicknamed Trish, was donated by 2 brothers who lost their mum, Trish, during COVID. Trish became a training vehicle that was left behind on our last trip, and it was turned into an aid unit for doctors at the front in Kharkiv. I actually have a video of Trish arriving in Kharkiv on the back of a train to the sounds of air raid sirens and explosions. Gets me every time. The lads have reported that repeated attempts are being made to hack their business website, presumably by Russians. They'd left their web address plastered all over the vehicle. They are seeing the funny side. I saw some incredible individual and personal acts of kindness from all the drivers. One of them had built an orphanage in Ukraine, and this was his first chance to get out there before COVID. The nuns of the orphanage and the children came to meet us. He was greeted like he was their father. And this particular driver had taken what his church had managed to raise to give directly to the nuns. Another guy nicked everyone's snacks out of their cabs and gave them to the kids. We only realised once we'd set off. I have to admit to getting something in my eye on numerous occasions. Thanks again for your support. I'm really very glad to have accidentally met you, and I know that my mate's family are really happy to have learnt more about Bill. Cheers, Ed. Oh, go on then. It's a while since we had one of these, so I'll just add, how good is that? And Ed has given me a note from the Yorkshire Aid Convoy about what they need and presumably what they're spending their money on. And the list of things is endless, really. I'll give you a very brief flavour, but there's full details in the show notes. We're a UK-registered charity delivering aid into Ukraine, requesting the following humanitarian aid donations: hygiene products, medical supplies, thermal underwear, torches, candles, batteries, blankets, bedding, tents, tent heaters, communications, mobile phones, radios, etc., laptops, non-perishable food including baby formula, tableware, crutches and walkers. If you feel you're able to help in any way, please get in touch via yorkshireaidconvoy.co.uk, and that's from a chap called Gary Dooley. And in fact, that's nearly the full list of everything they're after. So that list is in the full show transcript at fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk, and the link to the Yorkshire Aid Convoy is in those show notes. But to remind you, it's yorkshireaidconvoy.co.uk, and you'll find photos, videos and all sorts there, as well as that photo of King Charles, the aristocrat formerly known as Prince. You heard it on the Fighting Through podcast first. The following people kindly left show reviews in various places. And there's Andy Wake Up World from the United Kingdom. Andy, I hope you're awake. Anonymous the Four from Aussie. Eric York from Pennsylvania, JWM 1960s. And thank you, chaps. And Keith Gibson wrote in saying, my dad and many of my uncles fought in World War II. My father-in-law was a tank man in World War II and Korea. None of them would say much about their war experiences, so hearing about the experiences of others who served is a privilege. Thanks for your efforts, Keith. Mike Mullane from Tennessee wrote in, thank you so much for all the effort you've put in. To hear the podcast in your English accent feels as if you put us right there. I've read a lot of books about World War II, but to hear your dad's accounts from his own eyes and thoughts is truly riveting. Looking for the book to read now. Thank you, Mike. That'll be the Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg book then. Mike goes on. Back in the early 80s, I was in the army and stationed in Nuremberg, Germany at Merrill Barracks. It was once headquarters for the SS. I was a young private back then and was very curious. In the chapel of the barracks there were still the swastikas embedded in the floor. There were several levels underground that we were forbidden to go into, but one time I snuck down a level and found a Stars and Stripes newspaper with the headline, Kids, Watch Out for Reich. To this day, I wish I'd held on to that. I believe the paper was from Eisenhower running for president after his retirement. I was in the army, and my last unit was with the 101 Screaming Eagles. Be safe and Godspeed. Thank you, Mike. That's a nice turn of phrase, Godspeed. I haven't heard that one for a while. I think it's time for a very well-timed story, because talking about the Screaming Eagles, which Mike was, I've just received a spooky ghost story written by one of our youngest listeners, James Papalia. James is military mad and is a huge fan of World War II and General Eisenhower, and his dad Frank sent this in on James' behalf. Apparently James' teacher has told Frank that James in his own time has started to write a book. It's more a collection of short stories, but cool nonetheless, and they're all about World War II. So here goes. This is Chapter 1, The Secret Beach, by James V. Papalia. I was at the beach with my sisters Ava and Emily. The beach is in Stone Harbour, New Jersey. We were playing catch when the ball rolled down the dunes. When I went to get the ball, I ended up at Normandy Beach on June the 6th, 1944. D-Day. As I looked around, I saw boats, guns, planes and soldiers. I asked a soldier, "Where am I?" "Omaha Beach," said the soldier. I saw the Germans firing their machine gun at the Americans. The brave Americans landed on Higgins boats and fought up the beach. I saw paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles land. I saw large barrage balloons attached to the ships. After hours of fighting, the Americans were pinned down and in serious trouble. It was then that I heard Colonel George Taylor say to his troops, "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach. Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the heck out of here." At this point, the Americans began to turn the tide. They met up with British, French and Canadian troops from Gold, Sword, Juno and Utah beaches. Operation Overlord was a success. I ran to keep up with the troops when I tripped in a foxhole and hit my head. When I woke up, I looked around. I was somewhere new, but where? Oh, James, that was wonderful. Do you know, I had a shiver going up my spine telling that story. Really, really good. I just loved that, and the next one apparently is going to be at Dunkirk, and I wonder who you're going to meet there. Be proud of your writings, James. I'm sure there's a future historian in you, and make sure you keep your first manuscript. It might be worth a fortune one day. Thanks again, and thanks to your dad, Frank. Oh, and needless to say, do send Chapter 2 in when you've done it. A family story now from Bernie Walker. Bernie's from North Turramurra in Australia, and it's about a chap called Harry Cramp. And Bernie says, "My father-in-law's best friend was Uncle Harry Cramp. I remember many good times with them, family barbecues, golf, playing cards, and of course, there was whiskey. Harry was also a big part of my father-in-law's famous bushwalking club in the Blue Mountains west of Virginia." Sorry, that's Blue Mountains west of Sydney. I think there's a Freudian slip creeping in there. One weekend, while we were doing a bushwalk on the 6-foot track between Jenolan Caves and Katoomba, Uncle Harry was telling of the time he was in the Australian Army in World War II. He trained at Holsworthy Army Barracks, It was established in the late 1800s and has been in use since World War I. Originally, it was a massive training ground. In the entryway of my log cabin west of Sydney, we had an old train carriage seat, complete with the back wall, mirrors, seat numbers, and brass luggage rack. We used it to put our shoes on and off. Uncle Harry was not a small guy, and in the 1980s was a hefty 130 kilograms. I looked at him in surprise as he told us that when he'd finished basic training in 1942, they boarded an old rattler, an interstate country train, from Sydney to Cairns. The cars were full to capacity, and he said that the only place left to sleep laying down flat was in the luggage rack. He must have been smaller then. At Cairns, they were put on transport ships to Papua New Guinea, where he was one of the Aussies to go all the way to Kokoda. It was a hard slog for them, and surprisingly he never saw a live Japanese soldier during the whole trek, but was shot at a lot, so he shot back. From time to time they came across a body of a dead soldier. One time a fellow soldier said we'd better bury this one, and Harry said to the fellow, "That's very kind of you, and a noble thing to do to a fallen enemy." The fellow retorted, "Well, if we don't bury him now, he will begin to stink in this jungle heat, and that I cannot stand." At Kokoda, the latrines were all busy, as many of the soldiers had dysentery, and Uncle Harry decided he had to go really bad, so walked back into the jungle to have a dump. As he was doing this, he looked up to his left and saw his first live Japanese soldier in a tree with his gun pointed at him. He stood up very quickly when he saw him, and a bullet went where his head had been and grazed his buttocks. One of his mates was on guard duty and saw the Japanese soldier just as he shot Uncle Harry in the butt. His mate quickly dispatched the fellow in the tree, and even though they thought they'd done a good job of mopping up the Japanese soldiers, they had to do another careful sweep so no more people got shot in the arse. No Purple Heart for getting shot in the bum. Uncle Harry's final patrols were in Japan. The troop ship they were on was to be one of the first wave to hit the beaches on the main island of Japan south of Tokyo. They were lucky, as the day Japan surrendered, they hit the beach and went into the nearest town. There was not a person to be seen, and no one shot at them, as their emperor had told them to lay down their arms. And where was the first place the Aussies went? The brewery, and boy did they enjoy that Japanese beer. He spent the rest of his tour in Japan as an occupation soldier, making great friends in Japan, and went back many times after the war, with his last trip in the mid-1980s. I've not been able to find out the exact unit Harry was in, but I do believe that he may have been in the unit that Les Cook was in. Of course, we've covered Les's memoirs several times in this podcast. When I lived in Lura in the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, one weekend my father-in-law, Uncle Harry, and I were putting up a clothes line. And as you know, it's not easy doing anything with a committee, but we did have fun. Then a big black cockatoo was up a big tree near us, and it went caw, 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 and as quick as a wink, my father-in-law said, "Yes, dear." Harry, Jerry and I fell on the ground, still laughing, and if you knew my mother-in-law, you would understand why we were laughing. She was looking out of the back window of the house, where we were assembling the clothesline, and later asked us what we were laughing about. We quickly said it was a joke we couldn't repeat, and that just made her mad again. This is another family story from Bernie. This is about Jaroslav Falek. My father-in-law, Jerry, was born in 1930 in Brno, Czechoslovakia, near Prague, now the Czech Republic, Chechnya. In the first years of German occupation, he spent that time with an auntie and uncle in the mountains. In about 1943, he ended up in Prague. To survive, even though he was a child, he worked as an interpreter, as he was gifted being able to speak Russian, German, Italian, some French, Spanish, and of course Czech. He was very lucky, as his work as an interpreter kept him clothed and barely fed, enough to stave off starvation. One day, he was walking down the street just after several people were shot due to German reprisals after a partisan attack. Sadly, the Nazis would shoot 10 for every one of theirs that they lost, and sometimes even wipe out whole towns if one of the high-ranking officers was shot. They never knew what the Nazi SS mongrels would do. The townspeople that were nearby and were not shot were made to pile up the bodies. Jerry came across the pile of bodies that were put in a narrow lane, and one of the hands reached out and grabbed his arm as he heard a whimper for help. There was sadly nothing that he could do, as the German soldiers were watching, and he would have been punished or even shot and added to the pile. Another relative from his wife's side of the family angrily accused Jerry of being in the Hitler Youth, and when I asked about it, he said he did join, as he was desperate, and also they had no choice. They were given uniforms, clothing was in short supply, they exercised and trained to fight, and most importantly, they were fed, as food was also very scarce for the common citizen, especially in the occupied countries. He didn't believe what they were taught, knowing that it was just brainwashing. He kept his thoughts to himself and said that he did whatever he had to do to survive. Near the end of the war, he went back up into the mountains to stay with auntie and uncle. Then he went back to Brno in Czechoslovakia, where he trained to operate a delicatessen after the war ended. It was said by many Czechs, when the Russians were approaching from the east, that they were upset that the American army would not move through Czechoslovakia to save them from the Russians, as they knew what both the Russians and the Germans did to the Polish people, wiping out many more Jews and killing off as many partisans as they could. As the first months of the Russian occupation began, and seeing what was starting to happen in Czechoslovakia, Jerry, his brother Joe and 2 friends decided to try to get to the west. This time they only got a few miles, and the local police caught them on their way to the border. They spent the night in jail and were told not to do it again. Being stubborn, they tried again a couple of weeks later, travelling by night and hiding during the day. But they didn't hide well enough this time. On the 3rd night they thought they'd crossed the border and laid down to sleep after they'd crossed the railway tracks, thinking that they were in Austria. But German shepherds had got their scent, and they were woken up by their barking. They were caught again, as they were on the wrong side of the tracks, so they were in Czechoslovakia, not Austria. They spent the next 3 months in jail, as the police chief thought that would teach them a lesson, and they would not try to leave the country again. The police chief was wrong, as they certainly were stubborn and wanted to see what the world had for them that would be certainly better than what the communists had in store for them. They made a 3rd attempt, this time travelling cross-country, staying away from the roads, villages and checkpoints. This time they couldn't take his brother Joe, as he suffered from pneumonia. Joe was extremely upset, but went on to do accounting and business studies, eventually becoming an economic advisor to the Czech government, retiring just before the end of communism in Czechoslovakia. He was never happy with the communists, but like so many, just kept it to himself to preserve his life. Getting near Vienna, they contacted the Zatopek family, who lived there at the time in the English sector. The Velek family and the Zatopeks had been close friends. Emil Zatopek was a very well-known runner and a champion cyclist, going on to set records as a runner. Then he went on to win multiple gold medals at several Olympic Games. They got to a farm, friends of the Zatopeks, who had a farm wagon with a false bottom, where they were hidden for the ride under a load of hay. The wagon had been used for transporting downed Allied airmen and anything else that they could, while Austria was part of the Third Reich, and everyone was being constantly watched. With military occupation after the war, it was still the same with just a few more freedoms. They were fed, rested, and given more travelling clothes. Emil, being a champion athlete, had freedom to train and cycle through all of Vienna, even though it was divided into 4 sectors: French, English, American, and Russian. He trained with a team of cyclists, and as they trained almost every day, they were basically ignored, passing through all the checkpoints, then eventually out of the city. Their next destination was across the border into Germany. They found work on farms quite easily, as so many of the young men had died or were missing at the end of the war. On one farm, they were very well taken care of, but decided to move on after a few days when the farmer's daughter got too interested in him. Jerry was not ready to be a farmer in Germany. In a very circuitous route, they eventually made their way into Italy. Like many, they had a long walk to Rome, and when they got there, they were sleeping under bridges, seeing the sights like the Colosseum, that at that time had lost most of its floor and was covered with grass, along with all of the wonderful sights of the ancient city. Eating was a problem, and they had to take to subterfuge. Sometimes they'd go to a restaurant where you could get a carafe of wine and some bread. As the waiter came with their order, one of them would ask where the bathroom was. The second would then go, and Jerry would finish his wine and also pretend to go to the toilet. All 3 of them would skip, not paying a bill. The restaurants eventually caught on, so they couldn't get a free feed that way anymore. Being Catholic, they knew one of the priests at the Vatican and were able to get some assistance, Red Cross packages and food from time to time. The priest was a good friend to many. In desperation, and wanting to have a regular meal, the 3 of them joined the French Foreign Legion that had a base near the Vatican. They were fed, then clothed, fresh uniforms, and were starting their basic training. The problem is, once they joined the French Foreign Legion, there was no leaving at that time. Their friendly priest was wondering where they were and tracked them down in the camp. Talking to them over the back fence of the camp one evening, he helped them plan their escape. They jumped the fence, going AWOL, and hid in the Vatican. As soon as he could, the priest smuggled them eventually to a displaced persons camp southeast of Rome in Ancona. The camp was run by a big one-armed American colonel from Nebraska. He was tough but fair. A better camp could not have existed, and it was a very short walk into the town. They all had work to do, cleaning, washing, cooking, and occasionally work in the town or on nearby farms. The Red Cross was a fantastic organisation and helped out so many people during and after the war, and Jerry would always go out of his way to donate to the Red Cross. The Red Cross would give each of the people in the camp a voucher that could be used for getting clothing, food, or whatever was needed at that time. Jerry and his mates at the camp went to one of the local brothels and convinced the madame that the vouchers were redeemable by the camp commandant, the big one-armed American colonel, at the end of the month. To put it nicely, they had a great 4 weeks, before the madame showed up at the camp demanding payment for services rendered, and was very, very upset when the colonel had her escorted to the front gate. Jerry and his mates were found out and had to do a lot of KP. Jerry never did like peeling potatoes. By this time, 3 years had gone by. Jerry and all of the people in the displaced persons camp were offered free passage to places like Brazil, Argentina, Spain, New Zealand and Australia, where immigrants were needed for a wide variety of industries and occupations. Jerry, being the only one who understood some English, told his friends that they should accept the jobs in Australia. He thought it was a ship station, building ships, as some of them were experienced carpenters, but it turned out to be a sheep station near Bathurst. They'd all sold their warm coats, thinking that they were going to be working in sunny Sydney, then nearly froze when they were on the train to Bathurst, at that time a 2-day train journey. Some of the mates took a long time to forgive him for selling off their coats. The quarters on the sheep station were also not insulated and were cold in the winter and hot as hell in the summer. A long time was spent working sheep and fixing fences. There are many places in the Australian outback where a 50,000-acre paddock could be stocked with 50,000 sheep, and there would be the same number of wild kangaroos. Jerry, working as a jackaroo, was riding the fence line, checking the wires and posts one day, then looked to his left, and there was a big red kangaroo looking him straight in the eye. Now, Jerry was 5'10", and on a 17-hand high horse, so the kangaroo must have been about 8 feet tall, 2.5 metres. Eventually, Jerry would end up in Sydney, starting one of the first delicatessens in Glebe, near Sydney, and ended up driving trams there. A short-sighted government tore out the tram tracks in 1961, and Jerry had the honour of driving the last Bondi tram. He was given this as he'd stopped a runaway tram and saved the life of a woman who'd slipped and fell where her dress went under the wheels. If the tram had rolled another 12 inches, it would have crushed her legs. Jerry ended up being the head of finance in NSW Transport. In the mid-1980s, Jerry and his wife were able to go to Brno and see his brother and family for the first time in 40 years. Brother Joe and his wife Liebe were allowed to cross the border to go to Austria for a weekend with Jerry and his wife. Joe's children were not allowed by the communist government to travel with them, basically being held hostage, as was the usual thing while the communists were in power. When they went into a big supermarket in Vienna, Joe and Liebe burst into tears as they'd not seen that much food and that much variety since 1939. Joe told me that in their grocery stores there was one type of mustard, and in Vienna there was over 50 different types and brands. My heart goes out to all that have served in all wars to preserve and achieve peace. Good luck to the people of Ukraine in defence of their country, and my hope goes out to the wonderful people of Russia that will hopefully one day push their government to pull out of Ukraine and live at peace with their neighbours, not coveting what doesn't belong to them. Bernie, many thanks for writing in with that story. The timing is rather impeccable because it does partly match the flavour of Heidi's father's memoir coming up. Not just what you're about to hear, but the whole thing. So many parallels. On to a few Buy Me a Coffees now. Many thanks to Jeff Mansour, who's glad to have found the podcast and refers to it as Band of Brothers meets Band of Blokes. Thank you, Jeff. And Lisa Loftis has bought me a coffee. Thank you very much, Lisa. She's from Missouri, USA, and is a self-styled Psycho fan from Springfield. And she sends in an old newspaper clipping of a wartime recipe from her grandmother. And it really belongs in my mum's episode 33, Women at War. But here goes anyway. Get your chops and your taste buds around this if you can. It's called liver filling. 1 chopped onion, 1 tablespoon butter or fortified margarine, 2 hard-cooked eggs, 2/3 of a pound of steamed pork liver, 1/3 of a cup of cream, salt and pepper. Steam for 25 minutes in a deep well cooker or a tightly covered pan. Cool it and put it through. And it suddenly stops, so we don't know how to finish it. Put through. I'm thinking maybe put it through a 2-inch mortar and fire it at the Germans, but maybe not. They might fire some sauerkraut back at us, and I don't know which is worse. But, it's funny how the various nationalities are nicknamed by what they eat. We called the Germans the Krauts, presumably after sauerkraut sausage. We call the French the Frogs, and they call us the roast beefs. Jerry's come from the shape of German helmets, apparently, which resembled an upside-down chamber pot. And Jerry is thought to come from Jeroboam, a large bottle. Aidan Lee on Quora shed light on the nickname Hun for the Germans. Whilst inspecting corpses in World War I, soldiers apparently found belts with the words Gott mit uns, which meant God with us. But the soldiers thought it meant uns, or Hungarians, resulting to them being referred to as Huns, or, if you're an officer, the Huns. We all love each other really, don't we? Listener, do you know any more? I can't find any things the Germans called us Brits apart from Englander or Tommy, as in, for you, Tommy, the war is over. Anyway, thanks for the recipe and for your support, Lisa. Melissa Arnold from Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario, Canada. She's written in, she's a collector of stories extraordinaire, and she's recently worked in a nursing home and often listened to veteran stories during the COVID lockdown. So well done, Melissa. Thank you guys, all of you. Peter Skeggs Gooch from Windham, Norfolk, England, a podcast I will keep listening to time and time again. Peter's bought Dad's book and he's now a proud owner of a complimentary Fighting Through bookmark and souvenir photographs. And now for the main event. Roughly 2 years ago, Heidi Langbein wrote to me. She said, "Dear Paul, my father, Willi Langbein, was 13 when the Nazis took him away from his parents under the pretence of protecting him. Instead, he was moulded into cannon fodder for use against the Russian army. He was sent to the Eastern Front in the last days of the war and was never expected to return alive. Having survived against all odds, my father gives an eyewitness account of the devastating effects of war from his unique perspective as a child soldier. I've written a book, as yet unpublished, in memoir form, transcribed from audio tapes he narrated in German and from my many conversations with him. I strongly believe his story should be shared with the public due to its relevance to current events." That was my first contact with Heidi, and following on from that I produced a Fighting Through podcast, episode 69, showcasing Willi's story and appealing for interested publishers to get in touch. Well, that episode took off rather well for me and was downloaded over 12,000 times, roughly double my average. It certainly boded well for the clear interest there is in the German side of the Second World War, and that's backed up by the emergence of the new magazine, Iron Cross, and the success of Jonathan Trigg's book, D-Day Through German Eyes. And little did I know that when I tipped off my own publishers, Pen and Sword, that they'd express interest in Heidi, and within 18 months the book would be polished off, printed and distributed in the UK and America. How good is that, I can hear you ask. And who'd have thought I would personally get involved with the production of the audio version of the book? I've donated my labour for free with this project, so I haven't got any financial vested interest in promoting this. But Heidi is going to donate a generous sum to charity on the back of sales volumes achieved. So there you go. It's been a Herculean effort all round, and I must congratulate Heidi for her many years of effort to bring this book to fruition. And if there are any awards going for dogged persistence, she wins it in spades. You can hear me interview Heidi about it in episode 69, and she's currently busying herself producing German and Spanish translations of the book whilst holding down a busy full-time day job. And in case you're wondering, will I be involved in the German audiobook? I very much doubt it. But boy, we had some fun wrapping my tonsils around some of those German words. We had me sending emergency WhatsApp messages to Heidi, asking her how to pronounce a word, and her graciously recording the answer during what I imagine was her lunch hour. Words like Vertuchtikunschlager sounds like it would mean something like, where the heck have I put my beers? But actually, it means military training camp, which is where this next chapter is located. So this is your last chance to soak up the vibes from this book before you buy it. Unless, of course, you stay for the PS, where one final passage awaits, with Willi facing off an oncoming Russian tank. Sometime in the future, I'm going to be able to share some hilarious outtakes from my recording of Save the Last Bullet, because although the book clearly has a serious side, there is also plenty of humour, which had me falling off my chair more than once. Here's a quick resume of the book before we enjoy the chapter. Willi Langbein was just 13 when the Nazis took him away from his parents under the pretence of protecting him. Their real reason was to turn him into cannon fodder for use against Hitler's enemies. Deployed to the collapsing Eastern Front in the last days of the war, Willi, now aged 14, and his schoolmates were ordered to stave off the relentless Russian advance. None was expected to return alive from the final battles of the Third Reich. Against all odds, Willi does survive, but his ordeal is far from over. He returns home to find everything he knows destroyed. Numb and confused, he's mandated to serve 1 year of forced farm labour. After his release, he gradually realises that all he was taught to believe in was a lie, and he sinks into depression. Eventually, thanks to his friendship with a kind British soldier, he begins to heal. It begins to dawn on him that he can play a part to ensure that the evil he witnessed is never repeated. Ultimately, he succeeds by earning the Medal of European Merit in 1979 for his contribution to the advancement of European democracy. Willi's graphic and moving story, told from a Nazi child soldier's perspective, is an inspiring memoir of lost innocence and despair, but also of determination and hope restored. So, to bring you up to date in the book, our young hero Willi has left his home in Witten after his parents were coerced by the Nazi government to allow their children to be evacuated to rural areas of Germany. The National Socialist propaganda machine invested a great deal of effort in portraying the Kinderlandversicherung program as health-giving vacation trips for city children, but that isn't really what it turned out to be. Willi is staying with a German family in the city of Konstanz and very rarely sees his parents, one of the few exceptions being Christmas 43 when he sneaks home to see them. You may have heard about that in Christmas episode 76. I listened to it again yesterday and it's an absolute cracker. Excuse the pun. Willi turned 14 in May 1944 and graduated from the Hitler Jungvolk youngsters into the Hitler Jugend, where these older boys would choose a military speciality. And this brings us to the chapter 13 of Save the Last Bullet, military training. In early September 1944, 3 Waffen-SS Panzer Troop commanders came to our school looking for soldiers. "Boys, a great privilege is being bestowed on you today by the Führer." They stood in front of the class, impressive in their double-breasted black uniforms with the SS runes on their high collars, black breeches and slick black leather boots, the German eagle and swastika prominent on their officers' hats. Today, we're going to select a few of you to receive valuable military training so that you can defend our fatherland against the Bolshevik threat, the enemies of the Reich who want to destroy us. It was a great honour to be chosen to defend our country, and it made us proud. My mind replayed the newsreels that reported on the evil Allied forces that wanted to finish us, first by bombing all our cities to kill all civilians, then by torturing and starving the survivors, and the heroic efforts our soldiers were making to protect our mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters. The German troops were pushing the enemy back, and we were going to prevail. Our teachers and our school books told us that we were Germany's hope and its future, that we were superior and we would win. The Führer had issued the Volkssturm Home Guard decree, drafting all men between the ages of 16 and 60 because he was running out of soldiers. The Nazis started by conscripting the old men who were no longer fit for war, and those with minor disabilities who'd previously been rejected for duty. Anybody who could hold a gun was sent off to the front to fight the total war. The effort to engage every resource of Germany into the war effort above any other priority. We were next. Children were being drafted to fill the void left by the fallen, the losses at the front having become too heavy. This was a pattern repeating itself from the First World War. In 1917, schools had been put into the service of the war effort, leading to the creation of the Schule-Wehr-Kompanien, student military battalions. Children from our very school had been given military training, deployed to the factories to manufacture ammunition, and sent to the fields to help with the harvest. We were the unwitting participants in a repeat performance. We had been sent to Constance to stay with host families to protect us from the heavy Allied bombing in our hometowns. But here was Hitler's elite paramilitary corps calling us to action. 2 of the officers walked down the middle aisle between our desks in silence, scrutinising us carefully, while the third one stayed at the front. The only sounds in the room were their heavy footsteps as they paced slowly up and down. Eventually they made their choice. They went to stand in front again and pointed. "You, you, and you, come and stand with us." They picked out 3 of us because we were obviously the biggest and strongest. It didn't seem to matter to them that we were only 14 years old. When I saw the finger pointing in my direction, my mind went back to the day I travelled as a stowaway on the train to spend Christmas with my parents. I remembered the peasant women whose sons were at the front fighting for us. I had wished then that I could be brave like them. Here was my chance. It was scary, but it also sounded like an exciting adventure. The 3 of us would defend our country and make the Führer proud. We would march into battle and defeat the enemy or die. We were going to wear smart uniforms, ride mighty tanks and carry powerful weapons that would strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. I stood up and looked at the other two kids. We couldn't show any apprehension or nervousness, lest we looked like cowards, so we puffed out our chests, acting big, and walked to the front. The other boys looked at us with wonder, some of them jealous that they hadn't been selected. "What makes him so special?" I heard one kid say later in the hallway. "Don't know, but I do know you didn't get picked, you loser," I sniggered as I passed, feeling smug. We were sent to a Wehrertüchtigungslager, a military training camp, in Traunstein, a town south of Munich near the majestic Chiemsee Lake. It was a 2-month programme intended to teach us how to handle several different weapons. After the training, we were to return to school and resume our normal activities, but would be called if the Führer needed us. Among the weapons we were taught to use was the Walter P38 pistol and the Sturmgewehr machine gun. We were told that this was the first machine gun in the world that was accurate at 1,000 metres, a superior piece of equipment. The last thing they taught us to fire was the Panzerfaust, the anti-tank rocket launcher, a weapon designed to blow up enemy tanks. They explained to us that German weapons were more advanced than, and far superior to, the armament of our enemies, especially the Bolsheviks, who sometimes still used primitive horse-drawn carriages. We were told that not only was our weaponry superior, but also our intellect. The course lasted from early September to the end of October 1944. We were quickly disabused of the notion that this was in any way a glamorous assignment, as we'd somehow imagined when we were picked out for the privilege. The barracks where we stayed were large 2-storey buildings with mess halls and offices on the ground floor and dormitories upstairs. We got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, were given little to eat then and not much more for the rest of the day. There were non-stop drills from dawn until sunset. At night, utterly exhausted and with grumbling stomachs, we crawled up the stairs by the skin of our teeth to the dorms, and the whole thing started again at 6 in the morning the next day. We did get to watch a lot of newsreels. On the movie screen, the German eagle would spread its wings to the sound of fanfares, and we listened to the triumphant updates of how German troops had won back territory from the enemy. The German soldier was invincible, and our instructors told us we were to become national heroes. We looked at each other with a sense of pride, knowing we were going to do something important. After all, what could be more important than defending your country? Only much later would I find out that at that point Germany was in retreat on every front, sustaining heavy casualties in a war that had already been lost. And there we will leave it. It's quite scary, really, because reading through the book, it's difficult not to be struck by the comparisons with present times, and if you replace the names of the leaders and the countries, it's quite disturbing what the parallels are. It's a great story, and one which has few comparisons, but I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions if you happen to buy the book. If you're interested in buying Save the Last Bullet, you can get it from bookstores in the UK, USA, Amazon or Pen and Sword Direct. There are some links in the show notes. And good luck to Heidi with her launch. Thank you so very much for your support and feedback and for making the time to listen to me. I do appreciate you all. If you want to help this show, write, like, rate, review or share it, howsoever it pleases you. Above all, enjoy. And thanks to Kevin Collar from Utah for sharing a couple of my Facebook posts with his family and friends, together with a recommendation to listen to the pod. Good man, Kevin. And in that vein, Ben Etheridge from Victoria in Australia. Thanks to you, Ben, for being such a champion follower last month. Ben's been all over my Twitter and Facebook like a rash, Good on you, mate. P.S. When an audiobook is submitted for approval, you have to submit a sample passage to paint the flavour of its quality before it passes into the production stage, and that passage then later becomes the sample that potential customers can play to help them decide whether to buy the book. So here's the sample that Heidi and I chose to put forward. It's the very scary moment that 14-year-old Willi is stood in a foxhole aiming his weapon at an oncoming Russian tank. We were in Austria, Wiener Neustadt, around the end of March 1945. We stood in the holes we'd dug at a distance of about 10 metres from each other. In each of them there was a man, or a 14-year-old boy like me. Each of us had 4 Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket launchers at his disposal. The transport truck for the Panzerfaust was a short distance behind us, so we could get more if it became necessary, because it was a disposable weapon and could only be fired once. If you fired your 4 Panzerfaust and more tanks were coming, you better had run back to the truck to get replenished. My fellow soldiers and I stood in our holes and waited in oppressive silence. Nobody spoke. Time was passing too slowly and too quickly all at the same time. I knew a battle was coming and that I might die, but my brain was too jumbled to formulate the great thoughts that I imagined one should have in those moments. The minutes crawled by as I felt a vein pulsing in my neck. Somewhere in the back of my mind a tiny voice was admonishing me that I was running out of time. To do what? I was not sure. Maybe to live. But I couldn't focus on that because we had a job to do. Fear was something we could not afford. Then I felt it. The deep rumble. The growl in the earth underneath my feet, pulsing its way up through my bones. Soon the tanks appeared, their dark silhouettes materializing just over the horizon. I grabbed a Panzerfaust. The Russians had a famous tank, the T-34, the most versatile tank around. It could run over anything. Father Stalin had given his soldiers excellent weapons, we'd been told. Now I could see them firsthand. There were so many. The wall of tanks rolled inexorably closer, partly obscuring the sky. As they approached, I saw the Russian grenadiers marching behind the tanks with their bayonets pointed straight ahead. The T-34s started getting within shooting range. I raised the Panzerfaust onto my right shoulder, tucked it under my armpit, and looked through the viewfinder to locate my target. I'm Paul Cheall saying, Godspeed.